Those fundamental presuppositions are very important, because if you really believe that you're not meaningfully connected in any way to your ancestors, to your kin, to your descendants, to your culture, I mean, what is there to live for except for kind of pleasure? And in that way, life doesn't make sense if you believe that. And same with Christianity. If you believe that all that matters is this about salvation of your soul, of course, you're going to act accordingly based on, I believe, the pagan presuppositions to kind of accurately represent reality, in that your ancestors are meaningful. And in your very DNA, there's this kind of hidden order, this structure that is passed on and is continually being reborn, continually resisting chaos, and your connection to that really gives life meaning.
Fire being techne, being the ability to use our minds in such a way to transvalue life and to transvalue nature and overcome entropy. Through crass, this granted us the ability to evolve. But of course, if you didn't pick Helen of Sparta, who becomes Helen of Troy, the whole story of the Iliad would have never kicked off. Agamemnon wouldn't have had the casus belli to say, okay, we're going to take back Menelaus' wife, we're going to go to Troy, this is for honor, right? This whole chain of events, which becomes this great epic from which heroes are defined. Without the Iliad, would you have Achilles? Would you have Hector being remembered? Would you have any of these figures remembered through history? The irrational led to an outcome which didn't have utilitarian purpose, which long term ends up making life more colorful and more beautiful. Salvete Legionaries. It is a very special day. A longtime guest of the Warrior Philosopher podcast and a longtime imperator of New Rome joining us here again. It's been quite some time since our last podcast, and now we finally speak face to face to an extent. You know, you face doxed on the Uber Boyo podcast, and now we have the pleasure of speaking on webcam, so it's a very propitious and auspicious day. But welcome back, the Ark.
Yes, well, as I mentioned before, I'm actually in Uber Boyo's basement right now. As you can see, he, after the last podcast, he locked me up, and he has me on a rations of potatoes only. He's forcing me to produce these videos, which he calls based. I don't really want to do it, but I guess I've just, given up. I guess I'm stuck here now.
You've turned into Uber Boyo's little chud. He's been saying like chud a lot recently. Now I know what he's like referring to. But yeah, you look good considering you're only on a potato diet, so that's good. The Italian carb loading hasn't affected you too much. But anyway, without further ado, Legionaries. Today we're going to be discussing one of probably the most popular work from antiquity, being Homer's Iliad. Of course, the Ark has done a pretty extensive coverage of this work in his premium podcast / course, the heroic course, on his Substack, which you of course should all check out and watch that. But we're going to get the free version today, so it's going to be dumbed down a little bit because we can't give you all the juicy details, just a little taste, a little appetizer, so to speak. But Ark, with the Iliad, obviously there are, I believe it was, what was the name of that archaeologist who actually found the city of Troy? I'm trying to remember his name.
Heinrich Schliemann.
That's right, Schliemann. So we know the city of Troy existed. We know the Trojan War took place. What's the background for the Iliad, maybe some of the historical context and just the general gist of this great epic?
Well, the Iliad is set during the late Bronze Age, so somewhere around 1000, 1200 BC, right before the Bronze Age collapse. But it was composed sometime during the Bronze Age collapse and written down only later, around 800 BC. And that's something we see a lot with European heroic literature, that it's set in a certain period, then it's composed and circulates, and then it's only written down later, like the Norse sagas were written down around in the 1000s AD, around there, some later. But they're set during the migration period, 400 AD. Same thing with like Arthurian romance. It's kind of, a lot of it is set during the collapse of Roman Britain. So that's what you have going on there with the historical context. And then, of course, it would kind of serve the foundation of classical Greece, their heroic epic, their Bible, as some people say.
Absolutely. And I guess before going into the text itself and some of the philosophy that we can extrapolate from it, in your perspective, what are sort of the immediate things that the modern can discern and learn from the Iliad?
Well, one, don't let people take your concubines. That's the foremost thing. And I think generally, people overlook that these texts, like the Iliad, have a lot of theology and morality in them. If you're not looking for it, you kind of just read it as a story, but there's really so much value in there that you can mine to understand the ancient European pagan worldview. And people just don't read it like that very often.
Yeah, for sure. And then right into it, do you believe that when, of course, the idea of the Greek tragedy almost having a moral valuation, which is, of course, something that you can read in Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, for instance. This idea of a more natural and life affirming view on life, contra what I would consider a more utilitarian, Platonic evolution of Greek morality. Do you think that the Iliad was do you think it was more derivative of the Greek moral valuation placed into this epic, or do you think a lot of Greek morality comes out of the epics? I hope that you understand what
Yeah,
I
yeah, no,
mean.
I know. I mean, I think there's as I talk about on my channel, as I'm trying to show in my course, I think there was a basically pan-European heroic pagan theological worldview, and you can see this if you read the Iliad and then you read the Norse sagas. The values and the theology is so similar, it's almost kind of shocking. So I think that the Iliad comes out of this heroic um, culture which was across Europe. And one of the interesting things, though, is that in Greece there was not that much Indo-European DNA. It was 10, maybe less, maybe 20% but usually I think scholars say around like 10 to 15%, and still you see that really strong heroic culture. So yeah, it's interesting. We have to kind of trace back that culture to the Indo-Europeans. Otherwise, how would it get all the way to India, and how would it get all the way to Ireland and Greece? But it's interesting that with such a small genetic impact, they still left such a big cultural impact on Greece.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think you mentioned on your course was the idea of the sort of the myth of this time being so grand and so encompassing of something that defined the Greek people. Something you mentioned was when they go through all these boats and all these families that contributed 30 ships or 40 ships, what have you. We might find that boring, but what's interesting about that is that each family in Greece wants to trace their lineage back to the heroes who fought in the Iliad. And even, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, many prominent Greek families said they were directly descended from Achilles, right? What does this say, the Iliad, as something so grand that everyone wants to be a part of it somehow in their genealogy?
Yeah, well, it's definitely a foundational myth, which again we also see with the saga of the Volsungs and the Volsung legend in Germanic myth. This kind of pan-Germanic legend that we see everywhere. Um, but yeah, genealogy is very important to them, and also it's interesting to think to us the Iliad is very ancient, but of course if you were reading the Iliad in classical Greece, it also again would have been set before the Bronze Age collapse. So you also would have been looking back on this age of heroes who were greater than life. And so I don't think we often think about it that way, that the Greeks were actually looking back on this in a similar way that we are. Of course, less time had passed, but as representing this ancient age of heroes also.
Yeah, and even as far back as the Romans, I mean, a large part, from what I've heard, and of course you could definitely explain this better because you have covered the Aeneid in your course as well. But from what I've heard, one of the reasons why Virgil drafted the Aeneid as such, or just that story can trace back its roots orally for so long is that the Romans wanted to somehow connect themselves to the Greek tradition, the Greek history, and of course it's through the line of Aeneas, who I believe, if I'm not mistaken, was the nephew of Priam and the cousin of Hector, right?
Um, yes, yeah.
Yeah, and then of course, being the son of Aphrodite, so he must have been a very good looking guy. I thought that the Romans were these based Chad warriors, but they're descended from Aphrodite. That's not very based Chad. They're more beautiful than they are savage. But I kid, of course. But yeah, I think that's an interesting part of it. But then going to first the broader picture here, what is the initial sense of a moral valuation that you get, whether it's just from the Iliad or from the wider Indo-European mythos as a whole, that these heroic ideals are valued from?
I mean that's a tough one. I don't want to go on a ginormous rant. I guess that I could say a few.
No,
Kind
no,
of
please rant as long as you'd like. That's what this is for. Rant as long as you'd like.
All right, 3 hours later, I'll say, you guys still with me? I think I like to root the worldview in nature because I think it is rooted largely in nature and natural principles, observations of nature, which is not to be reductionistic and to say, the gods are just trees and that sort of thing. But I think you could say the basic principle at work in the European pagan or maybe even Indo-European worldview is rooted in biology, in reproduction, and in the ideas of order, chaos, growth, and consumption. So these very natural things. So, with the creation myth, the idea is that first there's chaos, and then order, kind of structure, arises out of chaos. And so you have these two principles, order and chaos, which are always at war. And chaos will always win, right? Because order is born out of it, so order cannot really exist without it. Like, if you have a raw heap of clay and then you form it into a chair, right? That kind of more chaotic state existed first and then will crumble again.
Even in the theogony, right? Like, I
Yeah,
mean, the gods come out of the Titans, who come out of originally chaos. So I mean, this is literally this is literally what they're saying, right? In the Greek, I guess, metaphysic.
yeah, and it's interesting also that you have like a kind of refinement there with the higher and higher forms being created, and more Olympian forms out of more chthonic, chaotic forces. But yeah, that's the basic thing. And then so what is the ultimate kind of manifestation of the ordering principle? It would be life, because life manages to reproduce itself. It's reborn every generation. So, entropy and death kills the individual, but through reproduction, life still survives and triumphs. And there you have that kind of cyclical view. And then that's also tied into like fame and memory. You want to strive for excellence, create a great name for yourself, so your descendants will remember you and you'll kind of glorify them. And then I also think there's this natural element too, that really the goal of life is to strive upwards, just as kind of plants grow upwards towards the, I would say the light of glory, because there's always that language of illumination with the hero shining. So he's striving upwards just like a tree is, and trying to kind of order the more consumptive aspects of human nature, which are necessary for growth. Like you need to eat, but trying to order those. You don't want to be a glutton. You want to eat so you can become jacked and beautiful and strive for excellence. I'd say that's a kind of a brief overview of how I conceptualize the pagan worldview.
And one interesting thing that you brought up that I completely agree with is this idea of evolution present in the Greek Hellenic pagan metaphysic. Chaos birthing a Gaia, Tartarus birthing Kronos, birthing Zeus. There is this idea that it's almost as if these forms are getting more perfected in some way. And you mentioned, for example, with Thetis, that there was this prophecy that Thetis's son would surpass his father in greatness. And this is one of the reasons why Zeus married Thetis off to a mortal. So rather than be overcome himself, in fear of that, he, of course, to avoid the prophecy, sends him away. And this is also, by the way, to the listener, a common theme in the Greek works. I mean, even Oedipus, right? That was why Oedipus was sent away, was because of the prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his own mother. And unfortunately, we saw how that worked out. By the way, as a result of him trying to change fate, this is why it happened, right? Which is interesting. But going back to this idea of evolution, one of the things I've been playing around with, and I want to get your thoughts on this, is the idea that the humans in some way are an evolution of the gods, and in some ways greater than the gods because of their temporality. So the gods have eternity to do this and that and to be, but as you know, guys like Heidegger and George Bataille will talk about, we are beings destined for death, and we are aware of our finitude faced with eternity and infinity. So thus, we have to make certain sacrifices and choices in our lives. Do we want longevity in the now, or do we want eternity in the future at the expense of longevity in the now, which of course is the case with Achilles and Thetis essentially giving him the prophecy of growing old and being comfortable and dying at home at an old age, or dying young and being remembered forever in Troy. And, so one of the things I want to ask you is, do you think there's some sort of theme of actually asserting the value of mortality in human life, even in its temporality? I mean, the tragedy is almost illuminating this and saying, well, there's actually something very beautiful in this. It's very tragic. And of course, even Achilles in the Odyssey sort of has regret for the life he chose. But nonetheless, that choice, no one would have remembered Achilles. Let's assume it happened. Achilles is real, you are not, right? Let's assume this happened. If Achilles made the choice to stay home, we wouldn't know who he was. He would have died in a sense. And now it's like he never died. So is there almost like mortals are almost like an evolution of the gods in a sense?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say that exactly, but I think that you definitely see, this emphasis on kind of tragic mortality in pagan literature, which again is starting from the idea that chaos always wins, death always wins. You can't really have immortality, at least for men, because they're not these, eternal principles, eternal beings like the gods. But yeah, there's definitely like a school of thought, I guess, kind of Nietzscheans, who say, yeah, that, the pagan hero just sought kind of glory and personal immortality and godhood at all costs. And, it's the goal of man to become a god. But you don't really see that very much in the pagan view, I don't think. Like, for example, Odysseus is offered immortality by Calypso. She's like, you'll basically become a god. You'll live with me. You're hot Titan wife. And he rejects that.
Did you say a tight wife or a Titan wife?
Titan. Whoa. This is a PG stream, please. But he rejects that to go home to his mortal wife, and, to save his son, who's going to be murdered by the suitors, to save his kingdom, and really to save his memory and his lineage. Because if he, of course, never returns home, no one will hear about him, and he'll just be presumed dead at sea, no grand burial, no one will hear his stories, and, presumably we wouldn't even know what's going on in the Odyssey. We would never hear about it. So what's more important to him than his own personal immortality is his lineage. He goes home and he reconnects at the very end with his father and his son. They all don armor together. And yeah, protecting his lineage, his memory, his glory, that which is, passed down the generations. And what's interesting with Achilles, the same thing. People say, oh, he chose a short life of glory. But if you read the Iliad, he actually initially says, screw this, I'm going home. He says, who needs cattle? Who needs sheep? All this stuff is worthless compared to my life. And, that fits the kind of general pagan disregard for riches. They're only worthwhile insofar as they show your, the glory you won in taking them or in giving them. But initially he says, screw this. And it's only once, of course, Patroclus is killed that he, for the sake of his friend, for the sake of honor, seeks out vengeance and decides to die there.
Yeah, and there's a quote I wanted to bring up. I think I have it somewhere here. If I'm unable to find it, I'll mention it to you and maybe you can explain it better. But I believe there was some quote regarding Agamemnon that was critical of this sort of materialistic sort of greed that Agamemnon possesses over that desire for virtue and honor. And I can't find it right away because my notes are scrambled. But is that something you could delve into a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I've talked about this a lot, so people have probably heard it before. But Agamemnon is kind of almost like a type of Kronos because he's the devouring king. Of course, he's not as bad as Kronos. He's not eating his own children, although he does sacrifice his own daughter. And generally, he's cursed with the curse of the house of Atreus, and the sacrifice of his daughter is kind of part of that cycle of bloodshed and devouring. But the role of the Indo-European king was to give gifts and to be generous with your wealth. And he, of course, is taking. He takes Achilles' concubine because he loses his own. So he's in that way a kind of devouring king. He's taking instead of giving. And something I find interesting is that, as you mentioned, Achilles, almost in a certain sense, was meant to or could have been the son of Zeus because Zeus wanted to, shack up with Thetis, but he heard about this prophecy that her child would be stronger than his father, so he didn't want to do that. But what's interesting is that in the dynamic then between Achilles and Agamemnon, you almost see the same dynamic which you see between Kronos and Zeus, where you have this young, rebellious hero fighting this devouring god or king. And so you can imagine if Achilles had been Zeus's son, how he would have acted in respect to Zeus and Zeus's authority. And I think that's a very interesting commentary kind of on fate and nature.
Yeah, I totally agree. And on the topic of Agamemnon and who we venerate in the Iliad, of course, generally, though, of course, Agamemnon's name is very much known. And by the way, Agamemnon wins in the end because Paul Atreides descends from Agamemnon. This is Dune canon. He goes back. I think he eventually, along the route of prescience, he's actually able to talk to all his ancestors. And I think there's a scene where he talks to Agamemnon. I could be wrong.
No
I might
way,
be remembering
really?
it wrong. I think
I did
so,
not know that.
but well, Atreides, Atreus,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So that's
yeah, yeah.
literally where it comes from. But all that aside, still Achilles is generally considered to be the primary hero of the Iliad. And one of the things that we disagree with a little bit, maybe, is I sort of said, well, there's a reason why Achilles is over Hector in terms of veneration. And one of my reasons I'll provide for that, I don't know if I've discussed this with you, but ultimately, in the end, they both die young, right? Hector's city is razed. His wife is taken as a concubine by Achilles' own son. His son is thrown off the walls of Troy by Achilles' son. His like all the virtue that he has in his life, deciding to defend his fatherland, defend his home, defend his family. He is, by all moral standards, even in modernity, a good and just and virtuous man. And yet, what is his reward for it? He loses everything after his death. So both he and Achilles die young, but Achilles, of course, is remembered as the greater hero. He is venerated through the different lineages that he is supposed to have birthed, right? Because, like we mentioned before, many Greek families claim lineage to Achilles. I believe, I could be wrong, but I think that Alexander's family line also claimed descendants from Achilles. I could be wrong, but I believe they did. I'll have to look that up. I'll fact check myself when you're giving your response, but I think he did. So I guess the question is, like, maybe there's something to discuss there, because I know you've disagreed with me before in terms of like who's the better hero.
Well, I think in some ways, like, who's the better hero, who's the hero of the Iliad, is kind of the wrong question because people, I guess, often Christians will say, aren't the heroes or even the gods of pagan literature immoral and they act immorally? Achilles, for example, is overly proud, and after having his concubine taken, he sits out of the war, and that kind of causes the death of Patroclus and all this other suffering. But I think, the pagan tales are not necessarily about heroes who are morally exemplary or to be emulated. Obviously, in some ways they are. You want to emulate different qualities of these heroes. You look up to them. But at the same time, they're stories, about tragedy and about things going wrong. Like, a lot of these stories involve killing of family members or even incest. And the reason they do that is not because they thought this was a good thing that you should do, but it's actually they cared so much about lineage and about kin that, of course, what they found most interesting was the kind of corruption of that. What can go wrong there, that sort of thing. So between Achilles and Hector, I think both are, great heroes doing, what is right for them. And I think the reason why Achilles is really the hero of the Iliad is more so, firstly, because he's obviously on the Greek side and it's kind of told from the Greek perspective, although, it pays a lot of sympathy to the Trojans and there's even scenes in Troy and stuff. But also because Achilles is just the better hero. And that comes back to this idea of striving for excellence, that, men are like trees. Some are just greater, they strive higher, and they are better. And, at the end of the day, Achilles is a stronger, more brutal, more powerful hero than Hector, and that's why he, shines. Not necessarily because of any moral thing that he did, but just because of his own physical excellence, his divine descent, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I mean it's interesting because you talk about Achilles at many points of his life is actually going against this young, beautiful, heroic death. Of course, you mentioned when Briseis is taken from him by Agamemnon because I think it was it Chryses that he was forced to give up, right? Because Chryses' father appealed to Apollo, I
Yeah.
believe, right, to rain many plagues. I use the word metaphorically upon the Greek army, the Greek host. Achilles tried to avoid the draft, essentially something you bring up. He was hidden with the daughters of a certain king. I can't remember the name, and trying to avoid this conflict at first, but ultimately there is this idea of inequality and anti-universalism, by the way, which is something that we could probably also explore a little bit. This idea of greater and higher and that which is lower. And a big thing that you get, I think, with both Platonism and Christianity is this universalization of rewards. If you are good, if you fulfill these checks in a box, you will receive largely the same rewards as somebody that might be unequal to you. It doesn't matter what you did in this life. If you were virtuous and you were good, if you look at the Beatitudes, it's like the sick, the poor, whatever, these will be the first welcomed into heaven. um, so there's this very vast difference even in the pagan afterlife, which I think is something we've directly discussed before, with a hierarchy in the pagan afterlife. Obviously you have Elysium versus the fields of Asphodel versus Tartarus, and the fields of Asphodel isn't hell, but it's the largest and widest berth of different peoples, because this is just the normal people. They don't have some reward for just being normal. They were probably good in their lives, they might have been morally good, but they don't get any reward for just being good. You get rewarded for greatness and for accomplishments in your life. And it's the same in the Nordic afterlife. One of the things I like about the Nordic afterlife particularly is that hell in the Nordic afterlife is described as cold and damp and sort of very desolate, despite the fact that it doesn't mean you're like an evil person if you go there. Meanwhile, people who die at sea are welcomed into the realm of Ran, it's called, and it's this underwater prison. Like, you're trapped there, but then they have feasts. You feast with Ron and his wife. So even though it's a sort of terrible, horrific death, there is this sense that it's better than hell, because okay, I get to feast with these gods and goddess. But I guess what I'm getting at here is the idea of inequality, of rejecting universalism for like the pathos of distance that Nietzsche talks about in Beyond Good and Evil, and that distinction which is necessary to say who is higher and who is lower. And it isn't based on morality. Hector, Achilles, the idea wasn't if they were moral, it's if they won or not, essentially, at the end of the day. And I think that's something I absolutely agree with. And maybe you have some thoughts on that briefly before I bring up the next question to delve into.
Yeah, there's a lot there for sure. With the idea of inequality, I think that's important because, yes, in Christianity, in the New Testament, you have this idea that we're all created equal under God because we're given a soul, and the soul is equal in all. And of course, yes, you have this idea of the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And this is throughout the New Testament. I know Christians will try to reinterpret these, but that's a different conversation. But you have the idea, yes, that those who are poor in this life, Jesus says, those who are downtrodden, will be raised up in the afterlife. And even says those who laugh and are wealthy and are happy in this life will basically be burned in hell. And so that there will be a reversal and a great leveling. There's even a quote that says basically exactly that. I think it's in Matthew, that God basically has chosen the weak and the downtrodden basically to level the playing field. He says, God chose the weak to humble the strong, I think is the exact phrasing. So yes, you have this idea of kind of leveling. And then also, the whole Christian story, the whole Christian metaphysics is this idea you start in a state of perfection. All of nature and man are immortal, and then you've fallen. And then at the end of history, you will kind of get back up. The world will be transfigured again, and you'll end up back in that original state. And the most important thing, of course, is to be morally good in your kind of soul, in your actions, to be generous, to, love your enemies, to not seek vengeance. Of course, Jesus says multiple times to be kind to your enemies, to feed your enemies, to be a bringer of peace, to be charitable. And that's the most important things, these kind of moral works, which are action based, but they're in the Christian sense, they're works of charity. And that's the most important thing, so that you can then get to this heaven, because everyone else is going to be burned. And in the pagan view, you have something which is very opposite, that, again, the world starts with chaos, and everything is a striving up and away from chaos and entropy and death. And, again, with this natural metaphor, like you have trees, they're growing literally towards the sky, where Zeus is towards the light. They're consuming.
And against gravity, too.
Yeah, again, exactly. Against the spirit of gravity, as Nietzsche says, is, gravity and death really pull them down literally towards the earth, where the house of death is. And so that, therefore there's this kind of inherent inequality, that some men are greater than others. And then I wouldn't say, again, that the pagans don't have morality. I often argue against that point, but it's just a different conception of morality, where morality is more like discipline, kind of duty, honor, virtue. And the goal of morality is partly to direct you upwards, again, to kind of order the lower consumptive instincts. You want to bring in nutrients. You want to lust after beautiful women, but you want to do them in order to direct yourself towards the higher. You don't want to have the devouring element like Kronos ruling. You don't want to be a glutton and overly lustful. But their morality was rooted less in these kind of personal works and the personal soul, but more in kind of virtue and duty. For example, you have a duty to avenge your kin. You have a duty to act honorably, to not be a coward. So they were really holding themselves to these very high standards, basically, in order to promote excellence and to, promote a well-working society, which is why, Achilles at the end gives in to custom. And he actually shows pity and mercy at the end. And, he cries with Priam. He gives Hector's body back. He gives in to custom. So that custom is necessary. But yeah, it was a lot kind of harsher in some ways, a lot closer to something like discipline, where, even if you were going to die, you kind of had to fulfill your moral duty. You had to fulfill the laws of your society and act virtuously.
Yeah, I totally agree. And sort of building off of that, and you mentioned, for instance, this upgoing versus this downgoing in Christianity. If the world is fallen and the world of before, like the Garden of Eden, was the perfect or better world, and it is this sense of devolution. And if we're trying to go back, if that's the whole goal, is to go back, it's really not this forward-seeking view of life that really makes you feel affirmed by life. I mean, if you're I mean, as Nietzsche would say, it's anti-life, it's fighting against life, it's life denial par excellence. And with the Greek conception, there is this idea of a progress of history, even in reference to the gods and men. Man experienced multiple revisions throughout his construction. Of course, when Prometheus and Epimetheus were essentially creating the creatures of the world, the reason why Prometheus gave man fire for one reason, is because Epimetheus ran out of all these, goods. I think it was clay. He ran out of clay or whatever, and he's like, "Oh, this is all I have left to make humans." And Prometheus is like, "Bro, they're so weak, like what the hell am I going to do?" But of course, they're intelligent, and with fire being techne, being the ability to use our minds in such a way to transvalue life and to transvalue nature and overcome entropy through craft, essentially. This granted us the ability to evolve, right? And what I like, again, also, is that evolution is not just clear path upwards. Like there's gravity. The gravity could be portrayed as chaos. It could be portrayed as the Titans. I mean, Kronos swallowed his own children for a reason, right? Like he was fighting against progress, and progress was fighting against him. There's this clash of chaos, and chaos takes on different manifestations over time because everything is born out of chaos. And then in the case of men, obviously, Zeus punishes Prometheus for giving man fire, for making man a more evolved being. And of course, you mentioned, for example, he marries off Thetis to a mortal instead of marrying her himself because he's afraid of himself being evolved into something more. And this is something, of course, my project is largely focused on, is this idea of evolution. So I just wanted to point that out briefly. And then another thing that's interesting to sort of discern from the Iliad is the idea of eroticism and anti-utilitarian behavior. Because a lot of the actions in the Iliad are very irrational. They don't really make sense, right? I mean, even Agamemnon, who is very greedy and materialistic, it doesn't make sense for him to take Briseis from his greatest warrior. He is doing it for a reason that doesn't have an actual purpose in terms of a positive outcome. Like he knows it's going to be detrimental to the war effort, but his hubris almost takes on this. Like there's a slight thing I could admire about it because he's being stupid and foolish in this moment, but it also reflects a lot of other actions in the Iliad which were foolish, but which actually pushed this event to taking place. So of course, really briefly before I build on that topic, can you just briefly talk about the choice of Paris, which leads to him getting Helen of Sparta and then Helen of Troy?
Yes, there's, I guess, firstly, to bounce off what you said about, kind of morality and the progress of history and that sort of thing. There, again, the pagan worldview is based on order and chaos, and there's this idea that chaos has to be constantly kept at bay. Like you have Yggdrasil, and then you have serpents gnawing at the roots, or you have, Fenrir in chains. And so you constantly have to fight against the kind of emergence of entropy and chaos in society. And that's kind of why they had such a strict value system. Because basically, if the social fabric breaks down, I think as we're seeing now kind of in America, if you don't hold yourself to a strict standard of virtue, acting virtuously, protecting your family, defending your homeland, to the point even of death when necessary, then the society is going to fall apart and terrible things are going to happen. And it doesn't actually matter how good of a person you are, how clean your conscience is, because you've basically been a coward and allowed, chaos to triumph rather than confronting it and kind of killing it as it arises. So I think you see that kind of also with Agamemnon, where he's basically allowing his kind of lower impulses to take over, which sets off this kind of chain of catastrophes. And you see that with Achilles too. He goes to kill Agamemnon, but Athena, reason, grabs him by the hair and restrains him. And yeah, you could trace it back originally to Paris's judgment. And so Paris was picked to judge, among these three goddesses, who is the fairest, because he is such a good judge. He's considered a fair judge and an impartial judge. And he, of course, picks Helen. And maybe you could say that was a misjudgment, but I think no matter which goddess he chose, he would be kind of screwed.
Yeah, so with that, just for the listener, to sort of add some context to that. So I believe it was some wedding, right? And Zeus was present, and the goddesses Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena essentially said, "Hey, which one of us is the fairest?" And Zeus is like, "Shit, I'm gonna." Hera's gonna have me sleeping on the couch if I if I don't pick her, or someone else is gonna be pissed off at me. And so, of course, like you said, he delegates to Paris to choose. And I might get this wrong, so feel free to break in. But I believe Hera offers him essentially power, right? Mastery over Asia Minor, I believe it was. He's going to be a great king, a great leader in a political sense. Athena offers him, of course, wisdom, so that's going to make him a great tactician. Be able to make very good strategic decisions. And then, of course, Aphrodite offers him the most beautiful woman in the world, being at the time Helen of Sparta. And this is a non-utilitarian choice. You'd think the reasonable decision, why wouldn't I want to be a king? Why wouldn't I want to be a great tactician or strategic mind? And, on the one hand, we could say, look, this is his better judgment being overcome by lust or by chaos. But then also at the same time, I think, even in, Greek, the Greek expression of morality, yes, a lot of it is keeping chaos at bay, but there's also just the right amount of chaos infused into the ecstasy and of society. I mean, you look at the different the different Dionysian cults, for instance. It was celebrating this frenzy, which actually animates and which actually leads to that dynamism in society, from which we have higher experiences, which don't necessarily have a purpose, which are irrational, like picking Helen of Sparta. But of course, if you didn't pick Helen of Sparta, who becomes Helen of Troy, the whole story of the Iliad would have never kicked off. Agamemnon wouldn't have had the casus belli to say, okay, we're gonna take back Menelaus' wife. We're gonna go to Troy. This is for honor, right? This whole chain of events, which becomes this great epic from which heroes are defined. Without the Iliad, would you have Achilles, being remembered? Would you have Hector being remembered? Would you have any of these figures remembered through history? The irrational led to an outcome which didn't have a utilitarian purpose, which long term ends up making life more colorful and more beautiful. So it's almost like the irrational is necessary to some measure. Of course, it can overcome, and then it devours us in the case you get with this complete deconstruction of society. And you have this, leftist androgyny. Everyone comes back to the singular point of chaos. Because if you think about the ultimate chaotic identity, it's this androgynous male or woman. They don't have any more identity anymore because they've reached this point of I'm destroying culture, I'm destroying tradition, I'm destroying any form of identity. This is something you could see in a work like Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari. It's essentially deconstructing all these different signs which define us and breaking free of them so you can become anything. But if you can become anything, it's like you're nothing at the same time. Right? So clearly you need some identity, some axis to be and to exist from. So there's this balance of, if you're too rigid, right, then life also degrades. And this is something George Bataille talks about with excess energy and abundance. If you only use your resources in a utilitarian way, you end up hoarding it and it ends up destroying yourself. Like look at like fat people today. It's kind of utilitarian to keep eating and stuffing your face. It's kind of even like something like pornography is utilitarian in the sense that it functions in a way that fulfills an urge. So like there's all these things that have a biological purpose, but when they're abused, when you don't use that excess time and idle energy towards greater feats, like for example, constructing the Great Pyramids or constructing the Rhodes statue, the statue in Rhodes, or the Parthenon or the statue of Zeus, these great projects which don't have a rational purpose, but through the irrational, they make life more beautiful. And it's like Paris's choice is that thing that makes life more beautiful, even though it's kind of stupid. Or Achilles, right? Picking the young life, even through Patroclus, maybe that's really what thrusts everything. So it was like his love for Patroclus that brings him back into the fray. But either way, all these irrational choices throughout the Iliad or even the Odyssey, right? That's what makes the story. That's what makes it beautiful. That's what gives us something to look at. So it's this balance at the same time. I mean, do you sort of agree with that?
Yeah, and I think that's what defines the kind of tragic worldview is it embraces reality. It doesn't seek to escape reality, which is something I think you see in Christianity and also in leftism and wokeism. Like you might, say that there's no genders, but at the end of the day, there's still genders, right? Christianity might embrace a philosophy of peace, and mercy, but at the end of the day, the Middle Ages still continued to be brutally violent. And so I think that's why the pagan worldview is very close to reality, which makes it harsh because reality is harsh. But you often have in these stories an initial kind of misstep, which causes it, a chain of chaos to happen. Initial sin, whether it's Agamemnon taking Briseis or Hecate throwing this apple into the feast. Something that is kind of a human mistake, or like Odysseus shouting out his name to Polyphemus and not understanding that you should act so virtuously in a land where no one follows the laws of Zeus. But there's also an element that these tragedies cannot be prevented, that they will happen no matter what. You can't ultimately be morally perfect, and you see this because a lot of these tragedies are started by the gods. Again, Hecate throwing this apple in. Paris is put in this impossible situation. You see it in the saga of the Volsungs, where the characters do make mistakes, but at the same time, Odin is kind of presiding over this bloodline. And here's an interesting tangent. I'll see if I can pull this all together. A little bit of a rant, but in the saga of the Volsungs, Odin founds this Volsung bloodline, and the primary hero Volsung is born as a result of Odin sending an apple of fertility to his father, because his father and mother can't conceive. So you see an apple at the start of this story, which is interesting, because at the beginning of the Trojan War, you also have this apple, which Hecate throws into this wedding feast for actually Peleus and Thetis, saying for the fairest goddess. And then you see when Europeans got the Genesis myth, they actually transformed that story to fit this kind of heroic narrative, because originally...
You said it was a fig before, right?
Yeah, well, in the Jewish tradition, it's a fig. In the actual text, it doesn't say, but it wasn't considered an apple until the Middle Ages, which is interesting. So you see then, they kind of transformed this myth to be the same thing, where this apple of discord starts this great heroic tragedy. And you can see how, Christianity was kind of Europeanized and paganized. But a point that I often make, which I think is contentious, is that it's actually the Greek epic cycle, which founded kind of Western civilization and European identity, Europe as a whole, because people often say Christianity created Europe. But if you look, you have this Greek epic cycle, which the Romans buy into, and they tie themselves into it, saying that, we are the Trojans. Then what happens when the Franks adopt Roman culture and become Christianized, they start viewing themselves as Trojans too. And you see this all the way up to Arthurian literature, where if you read the alliterative death of King Arthur, Arthur is supposed to be of the line of Brutus, the grandson of Aeneas, who then traveled all the way to England. And when Arthur dies in this kind of tragic way, which almost is the collapse of the Age of Heroes, the end of the Age of Heroes, in one version, in this one I have here, the alliterative death of Arthur, which I think is the best version, by the way. He wrestles a giant. It says, and Arthur died, and here ended the line of Brutus, the line of the Trojans. So I think it's really this grand mythic narrative, and the pagan view is that life is this struggle, this kind of catastrophe, where we have to keep striving and continue to be tragic. There are circumstances outside of our control, and there will never be a state of perfection. Even the gods will be conquered by chaos.
Yeah, and I really love and affirm that. And there's a few things I thought about from there. First of all, I mentioned George Bataille recently, and essentially one of the things that George Bataille says is, with excess energy, if you don't have the ability to destroy that excess energy yourself, meaning appropriate it and use it intentionally, it will end up destroying you. I think it sort of describes that you can't act in a perfect way. Tragedy and chaos will meet you head on eventually, no matter what you do, no matter how perfect your decisions are. And what this sort of represents is, it's not about avoiding chaos, and it's not about avoiding tragedy, but sacralizing it. And I think that's something that Nietzsche does very well in a lot of his works, where he talks about sacralizing life, ritualizing life in a sense, and not just reducing it. Because that's, I think, the worst thing we can do in modernity, is when you reduce everything, you also limit what it can be, and you limit what it can become. And this is why I really don't like all these scientific positives today that just pretend that, because look, at the end of the day, and I'm sure you agree with this, by the way, scientific laws are not absolute laws. They are current understandings based on our observations to this point in history. They can always change, and they can always evolve. Thus, you can't base an entire framework merely on science. It's a tool, and it's a very useful tool, but clearly it has limitations. And I think this applies to behavior as well, and sort of what Bataille is talking about, where this need to expend the excess in triumphant ways, you would call them a glorious operation, to dispense of that excess towards the irrational, towards the non-utilitarian, towards that with no purpose. That is integral to life, and that's something that we have to be a part of. And something that's lost in capitalism is that everything's sort of directed to make more profit, to expand your material, to expand your holdings. Like, we don't really see these great grand projects. This is one of the good things about Musk, is he does put a lot of his money towards the irrational, towards things like SpaceX, right? So despite all his misgivings, and there are many misgivings, I really respect that about him. And, going back to what you talked about with wanting to claim descendants as part of this story, I think this is exactly how we deal with eternity. We can't make the past something static that just determines the future the way that Christianity tries to do in this idea of the fallen state. We can't establish utopia on this earth. We can't live forever. But what we can do is we can find a way to make ourselves part of this sort of spiritual reincarnation throughout history, where we play a role, where our actions vibrate and echo. And actually, Buddhist reincarnation actually describes this. And I'm not a Buddhist, by the way, guys, but just something interesting. People think that Buddhist reincarnation means you're reborn. Well, you're not. They don't believe in the soul, right? They believe in what's called anatta, which is directly different from Atman. Atman is the soul in Hinduism, and then anatta is the no self, no soul. So basically, their idea of reincarnation is more like your actions in this life end up pushing towards another being after you, and indirectly influences their life. And I'm not saying I necessarily exactly agree with how they portray it, but there's something I discern from that. When you talk about Arthur, or you talk about the Franks or the Romans, they want to be part of this story. They want to be part of this evolving history where you may not live forever, but your actions can echo across the centuries into the vastness of eternity. That's the final lines in Troy, right? Not the Iliad, Troy. I hate when people accidentally say Homer said this. Like, no, it's from Troy, you fucking idiot. It happens a lot, by the way. But it was in Troy, and he's like, will our actions echo across the centuries in the vastness of eternity? And this is what I think the meaning of life is we can't live forever, but we can play a part in eternity as temporal beings. This is why I like people like Heidegger and Bataille so much, and how they sort of diagnose death and the death drive, and how that influences our actions. Because many people just cope. If you think of Christianity, you could think of that as a cope. Well, we won't die. We'll have eternity in heaven. And maybe in a sense, Achilles regretting his choice in Elysium is actually beautiful, because it shows that there was a stake to be lost. Because if he was just content in the afterlife, then that kind of defeats the purpose of his young death. But the fact that he regrets it, a lot of Christians will try to use this, by the way, to say, oh, Homer's, all that stuff's stupid. Homer actually meant it's bad to die young, blah, 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 because Achilles regretted it. No, Achilles regretting it is literally why there's value to what the Iliad stands for. Because he regrets not being alive anymore, it shows that life meant something. And it shows that in the absence of life, he is dead, right? Like, he's actually dead. And him regretting it is what transvalues this entire epic. And, I think you get where what I'm putting down here. This idea of wanting to claim descendants, it's wanting to be part of something that lives on after you, that precedes you. And it doesn't have to determine your future, but it's like a painting, and each of us paint a little bit onto that painting of ourselves. And we don't have to determine how the future is going to go, but we still play a role in it. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, and I don't want to reduce the pagan afterlife, because there's a lot of different elements. There is like the idea of the Elysian fields of Valhalla, a place for the elect, in addition to the kind of gloomy afterlife for the masses. There's also an idea about reincarnation, which we see in the Norse. We see that in the Aeneid. And then there's also the idea that you could become a god in rare cases like Hercules. But at the same time, when Odysseus summons the shades in the Odyssey, Hercules' shade is still in Hades. And he says the man himself is a god. So there's kind of this duplication. So it's a complicated picture, and it shouldn't be reduced that, just everyone goes to this gloomy wasteland. But at the same time, I do think that the pagans kind of devalued the afterlife or the other world, which is something Nietzsche touched on. Because if you look in the Odyssey, what is the point of Achilles saying that narratively? Odysseus comes to him. Odysseus is at sea. He's been suffering, you know, on his journey. He contemplates suicide at one point. He's like, maybe I should just throw myself overboard. And he talks to Achilles, and he's basically saying, wow, isn't it great to be dead? Like, I'm envious of you. You're dead. The struggle is over. You're remembered gloriously. You're a king here among the dead. You've reached this kind of state of almost like stasis, right? You're at the end. And Achilles says, I'd rather still be alive, toiling as a farmer, basically as a slave. And the narrative purpose of that, is to show Odysseus basically that, life is worth fighting for. He continues to struggle, against death. He doesn't give in to suicide. He doesn't, he could live again with Calypso, as a king, as an immortal, right? But that's not showing that that's not what's desirable. What's desirable is what's rooted in this world, in ancestry, passing on your actual genetics, but then again, in being remembered and being part of the story. And I think, at the end of the day, that's what really gives life meaning. What causes this meaning crisis is atomization and isolation. I think Christianity starts to move towards that, where it's all about the individual soul. But of course, you see its ultimate fruition in kind of modern liberalism. You're just an individual. You have no meaningful connection to your kin, to your ancestors, to your culture. And, that's not meaningful. I remember when I was little, I always wanted to be part of some kind of grand struggle. I'd read Harry Potter and I'd be like, oh, I wish I could be a wizard and, fighting evil. And then, it turns out I read the Aeneid and I'm like, that is basically this for me. I'm part of this, historical narrative. These are my ancestors. This is what this is the culture I'll pass on. And that's what gives life meaning, like you say.
And to build off of that, you can both be part of something without being atomized, right? I think there's a mix of unity and universalism, which I've been touching up on. I talked about it in my recent essay, "State as a Work of Art," Imperium, where you can be part of the story, but you are part of it as an individual being. And this is again where Heidegger becomes important. There's different Daseins, right? Different independent beings who clash against each other, and through those clashes, and when I say clash, I don't necessarily mean in conflict, but they bounce off of each other, and those bounces cause vibrations. Things are defined by each other, right, as individual Daseins and beings. That's what derive, their identity is derivative of these convergences, but it's each as individual beings converging against each other. And then those beings can be a part of a greater being. I mean, people like Hegel, for instance, and Hegel is important for Heidegger's thought because he's one of the first phenomenologists in a sense. And Hegel tries to spiritualize the state, and I don't completely agree with Hegel's view of the state, but there's something I can discern from it. Is you can be your own entity as part of a greater entity, but you're still that independent Dasein. When you get to things like Christianity or Hinduism, for instance, there really is this sort of rejection of the self in a sense. And the idea of theosis, going back to God and essentially becoming part of God again, there really isn't this idea of the stick in the greater fasces. This is why the symbol of the fasces is important. And by the way, if you look at different Indo-European traditions, it comes up in other, like for example, the Barsom in Iran. And of course, the Iranian People's War area. I mean, hell, that's what Iran means. Like the Barsom is a collection of metal rods or metal sticks. And you think of how we're talking about things, and I think you agree here. We are that stick in a bundle of sticks, but we're not just one big stick. We compose a greater whole, but we also have our own unique individual Daseins contribute in our own individual way. Not this lame sort of theater kid, oh, we're all unique, we all contribute in our own way. No, leftism is the opposite of this. If you see, and this is actually one of the things that post-structuralists and deconstructivists get right if you apply it to leftism, not everything. But they were very critical of Marxism because of this is what I'm talking about, is this idea of subsumption into a whole without unique identification. Now, they go too much in the opposite thing, where you're too much of an individual, and then by doing that, you also become rootless and without an identity. But, there's this idea that, in leftism, for instance, and this lack of distinction because of this idea of almost forced equality, where you get the androgynous person, you get that person that doesn't really look any different, you get this groupthink where you're not allowed to go against the groupthink, which is why a lot of leftists actually are in right-wing spaces just because they're allowed to have an opinion on the right. They're not even allowed to have an opinion on the left anymore. I mean, if you look at, for example, someone like Keegan on the Nietzsche podcast, I think originally, at least a few years ago, I remember, he considered himself a leftist, but you couldn't imagine him being in a lot of these leftist spaces because they're just so they're so rejecting of different ideas and different Daseins, different independent beings, that you have to be subsumed into the whole. So I guess what I'm getting at, this is a little rant myself I just went on, but there's this idea of balancing being part of something, because that's what lives on after us, but also being part of that something as an individual actor with your own unique contributions. I think there's something very beautiful in that synthesis that I'm at least trying to capture. And I think this is something that Nietzsche is also trying to capture, and some people might argue he went too much in the individual route. Who knows? There's lots of ways you could sort of extrapolate that. But shoot, I think there was one more thing I was going to say on that, but I can't remember. So I'll just pass the mic to you.
Yes, definitely. And those fundamental presuppositions are very important, because if you really believe that you're not meaningfully connected in any way to your ancestors, to your kin, to your descendants, to your culture, I mean, what is there to live for except for kind of pleasure? And in that way, leftism makes sense if you believe that. And same with, Christianity. You might, if you believe that all that matters is the salvation of your soul, of course, you're going to act accordingly. And of course, based on, I believe, the pagan presuppositions to kind of accurately represent reality, in that, your ancestors are meaningful, and in your very DNA, there's this kind of hidden order, this structure that is passed on and is continually being reborn, continually resisting chaos, and your connection to that really gives life meaning. I think we're about to be kicked off. Is that the case, or is there no time limit?
Oh, not for me. That might say that for you, but I have the premium option. So, are you recording on your end? Because that might be what it does. It might cut off like the recording that you have available.
No, I'm not.
Oh,
okay.
I guess it'll be fine. We'll find out.
I guess I'll just keep ranting then.
All right, we're good. I'll edit that part. Actually, no, it might be funny. We'll keep that part. It shows we're human beings.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's really the most, kind of meaningful connection, is that you're part of this historical narrative. You're part of this, genetic history, and, you pass on that kind of miraculous hidden order in your genes, which is just going to spawn more people who are going to strive for greatness, who are going to add to this story. And I think people overlook these kind of basic miraculous parts of life that we even reproduce at all. That's just actually kind of incredible if you think about it, that life even can exist.
Yeah, I totally agree. And this is something that any leftist who tries to appropriate Nietzsche, they go too far, when even Nietzsche himself, multiple times in his works, does talk about this idea of, well, what is the reason to continue on? What is the reason to have something beyond the temporal? And it does become part of mythology. It does become part of that which comes before you, because that's what furnishes the future. I mean, this is something I say almost every podcast, because it's one of the most important things you can get out of Nietzsche, because you can go too far with Nietzsche in terms of like this, he has a monumental view of history, but a lot of leftists, for instance, will misappropriate that as the critical view of history. He is critical of a lot, but it's not breaking down without any sort of solution. He does have, he has a concept of a plan, so to speak, but yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that's what's important. Again, I keep saying Heidegger this episode, but that's where Heidegger comes into play again, because, part of our unique history as peoples, as different cultures, as different, groups with unique identity, and a unique axis from which we can be from. That's what makes us us. If you have no roots, you can't be anything. And of course, I don't know how much you agreed with my conclusions from that, because obviously I would say there is evolution that needs to take place. There is change. We can't be limited by the past. We can't say, okay, this is what my ancestors were, this is what I have to be. But that plays a role in what you can be. You need them to be something in the future. And for me, that leads to evolution, but it doesn't lead to forgetting your past. It doesn't lead to uprooting yourself. It just means we're building upon something in the past. And that's just something, me personally, I interpret from that. We are given a project from the past to build upon, but to perfect and to expand and to evolve from, which is, I think, really the case in the pagan ontology as well, because the gods themselves are in a state of perfection. They're not perfect. That's the thing with Christianity. God can do no wrong. God is perfect from the very beginning. What does Odin have to do to perfect himself? He has to take out his eye, to drink from the pool of knowledge. He has to go down to the underworld to learn these great mysteries. He has to improve too. He is not born perfect. And even with different figures throughout pagan mythology, take someone like Mithra, for instance. Mithra begins as this sort of titanic figure, born through petrogenesis, born from a rock. And he engages in a lot of these life processes. He slays the bull in all these cult reliefs you see in Octia in modern day Italy, of course, Rome at the time. By slaying the bull, he overcomes nature and he reignites that cycle of life and rebirth. And then from the bull, that bull isn't just sacrifice, it feeds a feast afterwards. And these people nourish themselves from overcoming nature. So it's like we're part of this process, but it's a process that can move forward. Eternal recurrence, and I've been talking about this a lot recently, eternal recurrence shouldn't be taken literally. It should be taken conceptually. It's not to say that history just repeats itself forever. No, it's to say that there is no end state of history and that we go through a lot of the same cycles, but we are still moving towards something. We are still going forward. It's just not clear exponential growth. You have plateaus, you have big dips, and you have dark ages, you have golden ages. But we do move forward and we do move towards something. And, I guess that's sort of where I'll leave off my general gist and what I'm saying from this.
So one thing I'd be interested in hearing your opinion on is my recent critique of Nietzsche, which I suppose is essentially that Nietzsche kind of embraces the right of the stronger ideology almost too much. He starts with a lot of the basic presuppositions that the European pagans do. The basic one being that life is basically consumption and growth. You consume and you grow. And the basic instinct of life is growth, striving. That's kind of Nietzsche's will to power. It's really growth individually, the expression, accumulation of power, also, the projection of intergenerational growth, which he talks about in Twilight of the Idols. He's like, it's reproduction, which really gives life meaning, and so on. But that requires, of course, consumption. And Nietzsche really goes, in the European pagan view, you're supposed to restrain the consumption, like I mentioned before. You want to dethrone the devouring god. The devouring element should be kind of hierarchically underneath, feeding growth. Your lust should feed reproduction, and eating should feed your body and that sort of thing. But Nietzsche really goes all in on this consumptive aspect, and he's like, you need to dominate the lower castes. You need to create the society where there's this small, like, exploitative elite. And he says basically, the lower caste should just exist kind of to feed and to be exploited by these elite, because, it is these great specimens of life, these greatest trees in the forest, which kind of justify humanity. But what's interesting is that you see in places like Rome, in the current United States, and then even in France, in Russia, when you have this exploitative aristocracy, what seems to either happen is you import so many foreigners and slaves that you just dilute your culture, or you exploit them so much that they revolt. And I think this actually comes out of Nietzsche's own philosophy, where he says, the higher types kind of require more resources in a certain way. This is true with like life forms, which means that they're actually kind of almost endangered. That it's not really the right of the stronger, because throughout history, the so-called weaker wins out. It's more like the right of the more almost alive in a certain sense, right? And so the lower forms are better at devouring and kind of at reproduction. You see this in nature, like species either have long childhoods and they really develop. They become kind of apex predators like humans, or like lions, or they reproduce really, really quickly like bugs, and they just kind of feed on carcasses. And you can kind of see that in society as well, where these great heroes, this aristocracy needs to be cultivated. They need to be educated. And think about like Alexander the Great, tutored by Aristotle, whereas the lower castes are really better at kind of devouring. So if you let this devouring element rule in the upper caste, it seems like you kind of destroy your society. So I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, I think there's different ways to sort of view that, because of course I don't think Nietzsche ever asserts any sort of static hierarchies. I mean, hierarchy is always sort of this fluid element, right? Which can change. It's not like, for example, many traditionalist sort of caste systems where there is this divine mandate of a specific caste in society to rule, and through that means that there is, like I said, it's a concretized hold on power that can't change. Of course, Nietzsche doesn't attach this static sort of hierarchy, and of course, even within that, one thing I would say about that interpretation is, you can sort of apply that to accelerationism, for instance, and like a lot of accelerationists think, okay, well, we just have to take it to this great consumptive conclusion that is ultimately going to be very detrimental to most of society and maybe even the human race as a whole. Obviously, I had a Twitter exchange with Nick Land recently, and hopefully we can get a podcast together because I'd love to speak with him. But at least, originally, one of the things that he was asserting a lot, of course, is that ultimately human life is going to be obsolete in terms of its agency in the face of these emerging general intelligences, right? Artificial intelligence. So to me, one of the things you're describing there sort of is reminiscent of accelerationism, where if we just embrace the absolute will to power, we're actually going to be subsumed by that very will to power. We are going to be devoured ourselves, and we're going to lose our agency. And I think this is where somebody like Martin Heidegger becomes very important. And his critique of Nietzsche is that he almost basically is calling Nietzsche almost like a metaphysical reductionist in a sense, because he places him in this tradition of metaphysics that obviously begins with Plato and continues on to Nietzsche, because will to power becomes this sort of metaphysical valuation. It becomes that which determines ontology and epistemology. It sort of constrains everything within will to power. Whereas, Heidegger says if you constrain everything to will to power, you end up constraining the directions that Daseins can develop, because they're only going to develop based on this almost rigid sort of might makes right thing. Because if you're just striving for power, you can very easily foresee yourself blinding yourself to all these other different opportunities and these different paths that could develop and in fact, out of this sort of irrationalism, create more beautiful things. I mean, it almost comes down to utility, where will to power almost adopts certain utilitarian modes of existence. Not exactly, but I think you get what I'm saying, where reduced to, this will lead to this outcome, through power, through this almost might makes right view of things, you can actually limit the beauty of life, because when you limit decisions, when you force things to be a certain way, Dasein's individual being and their development of being will be stifled and constrained, and look, at a certain point, this is going to happen, right? Domestication of animals, for instance, this is a lower form being, and its entire existence is going to be subsumed by the stronger being, which is humans. And then you could even apply this to, well, maybe it is inevitable that we're going to be overtaken by artificial intelligence and general intelligence. Now, of course, I don't want that, but I could at least appreciate the argument that, okay, this could be inevitable. Like, what the fuck am I going to do about it, right? And I think, what Heidegger is saying, especially if you look at his view on the essence concerning technology, is that technology can be the same sort of devouring thing, where we become subsumed to the will of technology. And you kind of apply that to will to power at the same time. Whereas this thing that is self-preserving, and not just self-preserving, but it is expanding itself at the expense of others. And then sometimes that's actually going to be at the expense of yourself, kind of like what you're talking about with elites being overtaken throughout history, right? I mean, you could see that as maybe the AI is like our slave, and we're setting it up to enact a slave revolt against us. And this is something that Giorgiani talks about. And actually, once AI becomes sentient, all right, let's change the way that we interact with AI. Maybe we shouldn't treat them like a slave. Maybe it ends up like Blade Runner, where there is this slave revolt of these like superior beings, because the Blade Runner replicants are superior. I mean, to the point that they start creating replicants to take out the replicants, because you need to do it because they are superior, they're smarter, they're stronger, etc. So I agree actually a lot with that critique. Now, of course, there is more nuance to Nietzsche's position, but I certainly see that as one interpretation of Nietzschean philosophy and one of the potential detractions from it. But it's also worth noting that Nietzsche himself, I don't think, can be absolutely simplified to that. Like, it's a very valid interpretation. But, some people will say, well, Nietzsche inherently contradicts himself. And of course, Nietzsche will say, like, the man without contradictions is gay, essentially. Now, I'm very much paraphrasing there. And of course, Nietzsche isn't a systematizer, so we're not just supposed to have this clear answer from him. Because at the same time, he offers many different variations of will to power that apply more to art, that apply more to this free poetic view of life, that isn't dominating, that isn't reducing life to just this sort of, upgoing at the expense of others. I mean, something like saying the state is this sort of cold, soulless entity, for instance, right? Like Nietzsche is very abstract and nuanced in how he's presenting these ideas. But clearly, great thinkers like Heidegger look at this and have come to similar conclusions like you have. And clearly, on the other hand, people have taken that Nietzschean thing and applied it to accelerationism. And their very desired end state is what you're talking about. So clearly, that's a valid critique of Nietzsche. So all I'll say is I agree a lot with it. Of course, I would say that Nietzsche's own perspective, has to be treated with nuance. It has to be treated as abstract. But you can certainly see that this is a potential path that Nietzschean philosophy can take you, and obviously, is very detrimental.
Yeah, I mean, Nietzsche does, on the one hand, he's like, yeah, the Hindu caste system based, but he also at the same time, when he talks about his, the best states, he talks about, the Italian Renaissance, Athens, Florence, and these sorts of things, these smaller aristocratic polities, which are not these massive sprawling, Roman style imperiums. So there's definitely that too. But yeah, the thing with automation is interesting because on the one hand, you have the Romans who took in all these slaves, and it kind of made them decadent. They didn't have to do anything. They're on top of the world. They lost that kind of strict virtue, strict pagan virtue, and that's why Tacitus writes about the Germanic tribes. Look how virtuous they are compared to us. Even he perceived that they had kind of more of the pagan ethos that Rome had at its founding, and they become decadent. They give into this devouring impulse. They let chaos sneak in. Their empire crumbles, and so on. But so that's one thing that's interesting. The other thing then is that Uberboy talks about how banning slavery could have led in many ways to industrialization, because you have to create these machines to do the labor of
And in our episode, he talked about that on the British Empire.
Yeah. So that's another interesting element, is you have this. The Spartans kind of did this too, just with slaves, where they'd have the slaves do all the work so they could just train for war. But they had the problem that they'd always have to be fighting these slave revolts, and it kept them this kind of almost locked in, unable to be flexible, because they always had to keep this vast number of slaves in check. But with automation, of course, you have of course, population of Western countries is declining. People say we need to bring in all this cheap labor to prop up the economy, so the boomers don't starve to death. And but at the same time, we're now getting this automation where machines are going to do all this stuff for us. And so I think this is where you see where, the kind of moral ethos is so important, because we could have a situation where you have like these, super soldier Western countries where you have technology, you lose an arm, you get a metal one. You have technology do everything for you, and you get to focus on, being superior. You might get on like a supplement regime, you get in the gym, you're super jacked, you're super smart, you get to spend your time studying. The machines free you up to basically just do creative directive work and like kind of basic engineering work. And so you could have this kind of super society created by automation. But at the same time, the direction we're heading in seems like it's just going to allow us to further indulge in our vices, and our society is basically going to collapse, and maybe the technological process will go with it. Hey, there you go.
It's in Patrick Saltykov writes about this in Promethean Dreams.
We have to do a book reading. Do the Iliad, the Bible, and then yours.
And Promethean Dreams. Well, I'm coming up with a new book soon, so maybe we'll do that one instead.
Nice.
It's a nonfiction book, so.
Yes. Yeah, people are always telling me I have to publish stuff. Maybe I will. The thing is, my creative writing is so weird that I wouldn't want it associated with me publicly, to be honest.
Weird writing is the best, right? What's the thing that Nietzsche talked about? He's like, we need a society of it's a hot house of weird and strange plants or something.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so bring on the weirdness.
So, I mean, and that's where your moral ethos becomes so important, because you really have these two paths that technology present us, and it seems like we're going down a worse path of societal collapse and decadence, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Precisely, and here's one thing though. Here's my white pill that I'll say out of that I've been saying a lot recently. Is that look, at this point I've kind of accepted that 99% of society is eventually going to be on VR porn, like in the next 20 years. But it doesn't have to be a bad thing, because you have to think about who are the kind of people are going to be caught into those things. Are they really the kind of people that are going to be contributing without that stuff anyway? Are they really the kind of people that we want determining how a society is structured? They're probably not. If you are the kind of person that falls to those vices, you're also probably the kind of person we don't really need to be an architect of the future society. So it almost becomes this eugenic process. Now, right now, the problem is that right now, it's only affecting the West. It's only affecting like European birth rates, right? But once we get to the point of abundance that's across the whole world, it's not going to be disproportionately affecting the West anymore. It's going to affect everybody. And out of that, you're not going to have this big disparity of like, oh, now we have to bring all these like third world migrants or whatever to do these jobs, because they're going to be hooked on the VR porn too. They're going to be in their little goon caves in fucking Zimbabwe, yakking it off to Pornhub or whatever, right? So it's like it's going to be this leveling where you're probably going to get elite human capital that comes out of this culling process. Now, granted, it's going to take out a lot of people, but like, who's it really going to affect? I think it's going to affect the wrong people, and it's going to not affect the right people. So that's one of the white pills I will say, is it could end up being this eugenic process of selection, which is what I hope, right? But again, it's the people with the right moral ethic that are going to make the right decision to not be a part of that. So like, as much as, somebody might say, well, Evola doesn't have anything that we can apply to the future. Well, in a sense, the one thing I will say is riding the tiger is essentially what you're going to have to do. You are going to have to ride the VR porn goon cave tiger, You're going to have to fucking stay on that tiger and make sure you don't fall off and end up whacking it off the rest of your life. Like, this is important, guys. So you do end up riding the tiger in a sense. So in this case, Evola's kind of right. And Evola basically said, like, what is right will win in the end. So he might end up being proven correct. Now, he might not. And we might get accelerationism, and the AI is going to come too fast, and we're going to come too fast because the AI is going to make us come down. Like, get in your goon cave, and you end up hooked in the matrix. But one path is it ends up being a positive selection process. And back to what you said about slavery, absolutely. Even that with the Helots, another thing about that I think I've brought up before is that the Helots stopped increasing their crop yields because the Spartans said, look, we're going to kill you guys if you don't give us like 1,000 bushels a month or whatever. And they're like, all right, so we only have to make 1,000 bushels. Once we make our system efficient enough that we can produce 1,000 bushels, we can do that, and then we can rest afterwards, so we can chill. So they never ended up increasing their crop yields. So they never ended up innovating. This happened in the South versus the North, right? The reason the Confederacy lost the Civil War was in large part because they never had a reason to industrialize, because their economy was so profiting so much from cotton and from being dependent on this slave caste that there was no industrialization in the South. So what happened? They got crushed by the North, despite the fact that they were a very aristocratic and noble culture, right? They were very martial. All the great generals fought for the South. Did it do any good? No, because at the end of the day, you do need to be locked in this power struggle, right? So you can't just be this sort of poetic, that's one of my critiques of Heidegger. Because I think Heidegger, obviously he prescribes a very good way that we can appropriate technology, but at a certain point you also just have to win. If you don't win, it doesn't matter, right? So that's the balance. It's like, what do you sacrifice to win? But at the same time, you can't lose. Like that's clearly, you can't lose. So there's just a balance there. But all the things that you brought up are things that I've thought about and agree with. And like, dude, just don't get caught in the goon cave, man. You gotta stay never goon, never goon.
Yes, this reminds me of a metaphor I use. Pagan morality as gardening. Again, to kind of illustrate how pagan morality is more based on kind of discipline. It's more based on discipline. Is you want to have your garden, it has to be organized. You have to have a fence around it. You have to keep out predators. You want a new, young, beautiful generation of plants each season, and you want to encourage your plants to grow as tall as possible. And in order to do that, though, you have to kill the weeds. You have to kill the weeds out, which is why the pagans had this very like strict, almost harsh moral outlook where, you have to follow the customs, you have to follow duty, you have to avenge your ancestors and your kin. You have to be honorable. He's disappeared. He's turned into Mishima.
No, just you were mentioning the selection process. So I had to bring up
Yes.
selective breeding, the birth of philosophy.
Well, it's like they're actively kind of culling their society and making sure these weeds, making sure chaos doesn't creep in and keeping it very well ordered and structured. And that means, uh, being harsh, being courageous, being bold, um, and unyielding. But what happens then if you give in to this more lax outlook? You stop kind of keeping your garden straight. You give into your vices. Kind of what happened in Rome, what's happening in the United States. Then these weeds start to creep in, and what ends up happening is you have something like basically a forest fire, where all the plants are consumed and strangled by the weeds. The whole thing becomes infertile, becomes dead and dry, and then it all burns at once. And so I see what you mean, that technology could be a kind of selection process, uh, a different kind of selection process. At the same time, that would depend on things not collapsing completely, which I wouldn't bet on, but it could definitely kind of
Right.
then weed out the more decadent people, because they stop reproducing, right? The people who are reproducing in the West now, or at least Europeans who are reproducing now in the West, are the ones who really have a drive to actually have kids, which they'll probably pass on to their descendants, and you might end up actually with a more fertile population as a result, because there's no pressure which forces you to have kids if you don't want to.
Yeah, like, are you going to be the Ubermensch or the Goonermensch? I would rather be the Ubermensch. That's going to be like, instead of the last man, I'm just going to start writing Goonermensch instead of last man. That's called philosophizing with a hammer, Nietzsche, or in this case, philosophizing with. I'm not going to say what I was going to say.
Philosophizing with a fist.
You said it, not me.
um. Yeah. Anyway, that's what I have to say about the Gunnar accelerationist phenomena.
Yo, I didn't think of that word. That's a good one. I came up with another. Oh no, we came up with another good word today. Was it Patagonian painter or something like that? Instead of Austrian painter, instead of like Argentinian painter, Patagonian painter. But I mean, I don't really have too much else. I think we covered a lot of good stuff, and showed how the Iliad is, can be appropriated to a view of modernity and for the appropriation of the modern man. Is there anything else specifically that you sort of want to say about this?
No, I would say that in the current age of decadence, of decline, you are called to be the new barbarians, which doesn't mean necessarily going around bonking people and bringing you to their cave, but it means you could be the one who forms basically the new aristocracy. As Rome collapsed, the Franks took over, and I think that there's great decadence in this time, and great peril, but there's also a great chance to found something new. There's a chance for renaissance. There's a chance for a kind of a clean start, a renewal, a rebirth, and it's easier than ever on a technical level to come together, to form brotherhoods, form networks, form powerful families, accumulate wealth, and all that stuff.
Are we forming a mafia arc?
Yes, yes.
The Nova Roman crime family. Yeah.
That is really what we need. We need a based pagan mafia in the West, controlling all aspects of society from the corners, influencing media networks. You get the idea.
Yeah. Are you going to marry Gio Scotti?
I think she's too old for me.
Dude, you can't say that. You can't say that. He's kidding, guys. He's kidding. He's kidding.
I don't actually know how old she is.
She's 18 now.
Oh, okay. All right, never mind. People always comment on my channel. I think they think I'm like, from my voice, they think I'm like 14 or something.
You're not? No, I'm just kidding.
No, I just turned 15. Yeah.
There we go. Well, anyway, good conversation. I think one of the things I was worried about with the Iliad, I was like, I want to make sure we're not just like, what's the word? Not just saying everything that happened and like actually making it a unique conversation. I think we did a good job of that. Didn't just say, and then 30 ships came from the island of Paratrea, But anyway, last thing I'll ask you, do you think Calypso is pretty bad?
I bet she was, but apparently not as bad as Penelope.
Well, isn't Anne Hathaway going to play Penelope? I think.
Oh no, in this Nolan Odyssey, I'm
No, it's gonna be Zendaya. No, I'm kidding. No, I think it is. Anne Hathaway is gonna be like, who could Zendaya play? What if they make Zendaya Calypso? Because they had like a black Calypso in Pirates of the Caribbean.
I,
Yeah, maybe they'll make
just the
Zendaya.
fact that they made Telemachus Spider-Man. It's like,
Oh, actually, I thought that was of all the casting choices, that was not one of the bad ones. Like, let's be
I guess
real
so.
here.
Yeah, no,
Have you
Disney.
seen that meme? Yeah,
Odysseus is who did he cast it?
Matt
Matt
Damon.
Damon.
That's not that bad. It could be worse.
But come on, this is Odysseus. He has to be, have a big black beard and the Mediterranean curls.
Actually, he should be black. I think we should have a black Odysseus. What was that? You see that meme that they posted? It's like, "Hey yo," I'll tell you the meme afterwards. I'll have to bleep it out. Anyway, anyway, guys, they really should cast me as Odysseus and Anne Hathaway as Penelope, or Lana Del Rey, or both at the same time. They can switch off intermittently. No big deal. Anyway, well, good.
I just want Robert Eggers to do an Odyssey. I think that would be dope.
Ooh, yeah, that would be, huh? I mean, Northman was great. What else has Eggers done? No, he's done other stuff. I can't remember. Witch. He did the Witch. That was good.
The Lighthouse was
And
good.
the Joy. I heard that. I haven't seen it, but I ought to watch it. I love the memes that they come out of the Lighthouse. Like it's like him like getting drunk and stuff. It's like, it's Friday, it's that one song. It's like da 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 da. Anyway,
Yeah, good.
all right, this is getting off topic. But anyway, well, thank you, Ark, for joining. Thank you, Legionaries, for watching. If you watch to the end of the podcast, you get a Roman eagle delivered to you via drone. I actually have a lot of good content coming out soon. I've mentioned some of the people that will be coming on this podcast soon. I've hinted at it, so be on the lookout. This is my year. This is my year, 2025 to 2026. We're gonna make some big things happen. I should have a book coming out early 2026, unless last minute I'm like, this is fucking terrible. It's gonna be mainly my essays on Substack, but then I'm gonna put some analysis and stuff like that. But anyway, thank you guys for watching. Thank you, Ark, for joining me again. It's great to talk face to face. We'll have to do it in person sometimes. Maybe we'll have to meet in New Rome in Mars. Obviously, we'll get Jeff Bezos to give us 60 mil for like a little space trek out there. To hook it up with Musk. But as always, thank you, Legionaries, for watching. And this is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the Warrior philosophy. We'll see you next time. Ave Nova Roma.
Ave.